In Job 31, he gives a list of the sins that he never committed. And the whole of that chapter is a list, and there are 11 sins he said he never committed. And while we were installing elders a few nights ago, the thought came to me that Job is a pretty good picture of what an elder ought to be. And you can find all the references, all in chapter 31. The sins he did not commit. Number 1, lusting after a young woman. Number 2, falsehood and deceitful actions, especially in business. Number 3, adultery. Number 4, oppression of his employees. Number 5, withholding mercy from widows and orphans. And then he says, on the contrary, he always cared for them. Number 6, trusting in his wealth. Number 7, idolatry, the worship of the sun and the moon. Number 8, rejoicing over his enemies' misfortune. Number 9, failure to show hospitality to strangers, which in the Middle East is still a terrible crime. Number 10, failure to acknowledge his sin through fear of man. And number 11, injustice toward those who cultivated his land. So and you see it's a very typical list of sins for that culture, where hospitality to strangers was one of the number 1 requirements. But let me just say one more thing about the word prosperity, because I've kind of shot holes in what I call the prosperity gospel. But the Bible clearly promises prosperity. Psalm 1 verse 3, whatever he does shall prosper. To Joshua, God said, then you will make your way prosperous and you will have good success. And there are many, many other promises. What I want to suggest to you is that American culture has perverted the meaning of the word prosperity. And what we call prosperity is not what the Bible calls prosperity. The word prosperous comes from a Latin word, prosperous. And one of the ways it's frequently used in Latin is to describe a general who has conducted a successful campaign. He would return to Rome, and it would say in Latin, Re prosperi gesta. He has prosperously carried out his assignment. And so if you want a biblical picture of prosperity, it's not the modern American view with a Cadillac or a Mercedes and a lot of money and fancy clothes and diamonds. Not that I'm against any of those things, but that's not prosperity in the Bible. Prosperity is successfully accomplishing your assigned task. Like the general who was sent out, defeated the enemy, added territory to the Roman Empire, and returned, and they said, he has prosperously carried out his assignment. And if you understand that, then you can begin to expect biblical prosperity if you meet the conditions. You see, if the contemporary picture of prosperity were true, then Jesus and his apostles were the most awful failures. I mean, they did not prosper. Is that right? Where's the man with the NIV? Somebody. Anybody. This is so vivid. I was preaching in Ghana some years back, and I preached, thank you very much, on the ministry gifts, apostles, prophets, etc., evangelists. And there were a lot of fine young men there. So I said, now how many of you would like to be apostles? And a lot of them put their hands up and stood up. Well, I said, before you answer the question, let me give you the job description. So I went back and I read 1 Corinthians chapter 4. I don't know why this Bible doesn't open to 1 Corinthians. There must be some prejudice. All right. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. Paul is writing to the Corinthian Christians. And if anybody was charismatic, they were. And he says, "For who makes you different from anyone else? What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? Already you have all you want. You're very prosperous." In the wrong sense. "Already you have become rich. You have become kings. And that without us, the apostles. How I wish that you really had become kings, so that we might be kings with you. For it seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like men condemned to die in the arena." The picture is a line of prisoners, other people being led out to the arena to be put to death. And the apostles are in the line at the end, the last. "We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to men. We are fools for Christ, but you are so wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are honored, we are dishonored. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty, we are in rags, we are brutally treated, we are homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. Up to this moment, we have become the scum of the earth, the refuse of the world." So I then said to those young men, "Now how many of you want the job?" And still a considerable number of them stood up, but not nearly as many as the first time. So, what kind of prosperity did the apostles have? Not what Americans call prosperity today. But they prospered because they successfully accomplished the task assigned to them by God. And that is prosperity. Thank you so much, John. Let me give you just a couple of places where the word is used. Joshua 1, verse 8. "Then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success, if you listen to and do all the words of this law." Now, what kind of a man was Joshua after that? He was a military commander. He didn't ride in a Cadillac, he rode in a tank. He didn't sleep in first-class hotels, he slept out in the open. He had a tough life. Exacting, demanding. It took all his strength, all his determination. But he prospered. Not in the American sense, but in the biblical sense. And then in Romans 1 verse 10, Paul says, and this is the old King James, but it's the best translation. He said, "I prayed that I might have a prosperous journey to you in Rome by the will of God." Now, exactly the same Greek word is used in 3 John verse 2, where it says, "Beloved, I wish above all things that you may prosper and be in health." Exactly the same word is used in Romans 1 and 3 John verse 2. Now, for various reasons, it's not easy to translate it the same way. Although the old King James did. In Romans 1 it said that I may have a prosperous journey. And in 3 John verse 2 it said that you may prosper and be in health. The word was preserved. Now, how did God answer Paul's prayer for a prosperous journey to Rome? Did he travel first class on a luxury liner with all his meals provided and waiters to serve him? How did he travel? He traveled as a prisoner in chains on a ship that went through a most remarkable storm of 14 days and nights when they never saw the sun. And when they got out of the storm, He and all the others were shipwrecked on the island of Malta. They got onto the shore and they were very cold and they kindled a fire. And this is typical of Paul. He didn't stand around watching other people work. He was out there gathering fuel. And what happened? They picked up a stick and a viper fastened on his hand. Was that a prosperous journey? Well, it was prosperous in this sense that he didn't die. First of all, the local natives thought he was a criminal whom justice would not permit to live, although he'd escaped the sea. But when he didn't die, they changed their mind and decided he must be a god. And then he prayed for the chief man of the island who was healed of dysentery. And all the people on the island came to get prayed for. And so eventually they went on to Rome. Now that was not a prosperous journey by contemporary American standards, was it? But it was a prosperous journey because Paul accomplished the purpose of God. And 277 other people were saved because of Paul. You see what I'm saying? I hope I can communicate it. It is the will of God for you to prosper. But there's very little in the New Testament to suggest that it's to prosper by American contemporary standards. Am I right? I mean, if success is the mark, as we understand it, then Jesus and his apostles were the most abysmal failures. Jesus ended his life on a Roman gibbet, naked, scoffed, beaten, bleeding. And it's very interesting. That's the last the world ever saw of Jesus. God never tried to correct that picture. The only people who saw him afterwards were witnesses chosen before their God. So God has allowed that picture to persist throughout history. And then you take Paul and Peter, the two most well-known apostles. Paul was executed in a Roman jail, and Peter was crucified upside down. Is that prosperity? It is, but not by our standards. See, what Christians habitually do all through the ages is take the language of the New Testament, apply it to their own lifestyle, and say, that's it. And it never is. This is not the first time this has happened. All through history. Rather than comply with the standards of the New Testament, Christians have said, this is the way we're going to live, and we'll give it Christian titles. But it isn't true. So I just want to make clear to you, I believe it's the will of God for Christians to prosper. But I believe that today, in much of the church, there's a totally incorrect interpretation of prosperity. And I'm inclined to think this is highly relevant because if I understand what God seems to be saying through his word, we are going to go into times in America where it will be the very reverse of what's normally called prosperity. And how will you react? Will you say, the Bible isn't true, God has failed, I'm going to give up my faith? Or are you going to be a realist? Are you going to be like Job's comforters and use a lot of religious language? Or are you going to be like Job and tell it like it is? Now, after 31, we have 32, 33, 34, 35, and 36. That's 5 chapters. 37, 6 chapters. From a young man named Elihu. Now, young in those days was probably 50 or 60. And this is something, the Bible just doesn't tell you some things. It leaves you to think for yourself. Elihu was much younger than the other men, and he said, I really oughtn't to be speaking, but you're all wrong, and I want to straighten you out. And he, as I say, he gives 5 chapters. And the interesting thing is, and I'm not sure I can explain it, is when God comments on everybody, he totally ignores Elihu. And I can't help wondering how Elihu felt at the end of it. He must have been either sitting or standing, waiting. What is God going to say about what I said? And the answer is God passed him over in total silence. And I don't know why. But anyhow, we're going to do the same. Not because of any prejudice against him, but because we don't have time. It's a remarkable achievement if we can go through the book of Job in 2 sessions, believe me. So, chapter 38 is where we're going to start. Now we come to the Lord, appeared in a whirlwind, or didn't appear, but was present in a whirlwind. And he answered Job direct. I think it must have been a somewhat frightening experience for all those people there when the whirlwind came up, and who knows how it affected them. And then out of the whirlwind, God himself in person spoke to them. And the first thing he said, now I'm going to paraphrase this, he spoke to Job and he said, "You've been talking about things you just don't understand." Your words were absolutely out of place, irrelevant. But anyhow, I'll help you. So somebody said sometimes about people, every time they open their mouth, they put their foot in it. So if you should be one of those people, bear in mind the Lord still loves you. And he's got an answer for you. So I'm going to try and sum up what God said. It's chapters 38, 39, 40, and 41. Which is 38 to 41 is 4 chapters, isn't it? All right, now this is my summation. God describes to Job and his friends how he runs the universe. And he gives a lot of details, which we'll go into in a moment. And then he challenges Job, and he said, "Do you want to take over the job?" That's the essence of what he said. Can you do a better job than I do of running the universe? And then he goes into a lot of detail about what's involved in running the universe. And this is what he says. It's in Job 38, beginning at verse 4, and going through the end of chapter 41. And here are some of the things that God deals with while he runs the universe. And there's a long list. It's rather interesting. And he's saying to Job all the time, "Could you handle this? Or could you handle that?" Verses 4 through 7, he says, "The creation of the earth, were you there?" Verses 8 through 11, he said, "Can you control the sea?" 12 through 15, "Can you control the sunrise and the sunlight?" Especially in relationship to controlling the wicked. Then in verses 16 through 18, he says, "Do you know the dimensions of the earth? And do you know the nether world, Hades and the abode of the dead?" Verses 19 through 21, he says, "What can you do about light and darkness?" Verses 22 through 30, he says, "Can you control the elements, the sun, the rain, the frost, and the cold?" In verses 31 through 35, he says, "Can you control the constellations and the heavenly bodies?" Verses 34 through 38, he says, "Can you control the rain and the snow? Are they under your control? Do you know how to manage them?" Then in chapter 38, verse 39, through chapter 39, he speaks about a number of living creatures, all of whom he has his eye on. And the list is quite interesting. And so these are the following: lions, ravens, mountain goats, deer. With regard to the deer, he says, "Do you know the time when they bring forth? Can you be a midwife to the deer? Can you count the months for them? The wild donkeys, the onager, which is another kind of donkey, the wild ox, the ostrich, the stork, the horse, the hawk, and the eagle." In Job 40, verses 1 and 2, Job says, in effect, "I give up." Then Job answered the Lord. Job answered, verse 3 through 5. "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further. I render that, Lord, I give up. But then the Lord goes on in chapter 40, verses 6 through 14, and he says, which is very significant, can you take over dealing with the wicked? And I think I'll read those verses. As I meditated on this, and I thought about the appalling wickedness that is rampant in the earth today, I said, thank God I don't have to deal with it. This is what he says. Would you indeed annul my judgment? That's chapter 40, verse 8. Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God? Or can you thunder with a voice like his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor, and array yourself with glory and beauty. Disperse the rage of your wrath. Look on everyone who is proud, and humble him. Look on everyone who is proud, and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together. Bind their faces in hidden darkness. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. And I think that's a challenge to you and me. Can we deal with the wickedness that's in the earth today? Do we know how to treat the wicked? Do we know how to bring them into subjection? The answer is definitely no. I'm so thankful that God does. I'm prepared to leave the job to him. I'm not willing to take that job over. And then, in chapter 40, verses 15 through 24, and chapter 41, the whole chapter, he deals with two particular creatures. In chapter 40, verse 15, he says, look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. And we don't know what behemoth is. Some people think it's the elephant. I think that's quite possible. You know, the word elephant, I'm not sure I can give you the whole history of it, but the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph. And the elephant is elephant because he's number one. See? And so God says, can you deal with the elephant? And he goes into quite a lot of detail about the elephant. If that is so. Then chapter 41, there are 34 verses that deal with one creature, which is amazing if you think how economical the Bible is of words. And this creature is called Leviathan. And there's a very, very vivid picture of Leviathan. And I don't think anybody knows for sure, but if you read the description, the thing it sounds most like is a dragon, because it has fiery breath. Its breath can kindle coals, and it's totally impervious to any kind of weapon. Any weapon you use against it just doesn't have any effect on it. Now this is simply a thought, but you know that in many mythologies, especially in China, there are many vivid pictures of the dragon. And I personally believe there is a reality behind them. I believe there is a Leviathan. The Bible speaks about him in various places. Apparently, Leviathan lives mainly in the sea. Many, many years ago, and I always regret deeply that I didn't keep this record. I got hold, in the 1950s, I got hold of a book in England that recorded reports from the British Navy of a creature that had been seen on several occasions in the sea. And it was very long, and it curled up in many different... And this was official naval reports. This is not hearsay. And I believe that probably that was a sighting of Leviathan. There's other references to Leviathan which we won't go into, but I believe that Leviathan is or was, in fact I believe is, a real creature. And God says, can you deal with Leviathan? And it's very interesting because, there are 34 verses describing Leviathan. He must be of some significance. And the final verse, verse 34, speaking of Leviathan, says, he beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. That really is a description of Satan. He is the king over all the children of pride. If you look for a moment in Ephesians chapter 2, Paul says about those of us who were dead in trespasses and sins, in Ephesians 2 verses 1 and 2, you who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked, according to the course of this age, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. That's really the same thing as the one who is king over all the children of pride. So in a certain sense, God is saying, can you deal with Satan? You know what my answer is? Definitely not. I'm glad that God has accepted the responsibility. I don't want to take the job out of his hands. And when Job was confronted with this, he said, Lord, far be it from me. But I think there's a very important lesson. Lots of people today impugn the way God is running the world. They have all sorts of criticisms. Why doesn't he stop war? Why doesn't he stop famine? Why doesn't he stop disease? But God says, are you prepared to take over? Can you do a better job than I'm doing? If not, let me run my business my way. And I think that's a message to all of us. It's not just for Job. Now, the next thing that comes out of God's answer is very important. And I think it's often overlooked. It's this. God is not remote and indifferent in regard to his creation. He is continuously and intimately concerned with all his creatures, whether it's a donkey or a goat or a hawk or an eagle or whatever. He's not remote. He doesn't view it from afar. He's interested. He's interested in the time that the deer give birth. He's watching over it. See, that's a very different picture from what most people have of God. Let me give you just one picture from Jesus, which says it all in a way. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 29. Matthew 10:29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But that's a very unfortunate translation, because what the old King James said was right. Not one of them falls to the ground without your Father. In other words, God the Father is interested in every sparrow that falls to the ground. I heard a preacher once say, God takes time out to attend the sparrow's funeral. That's a totally different picture from what most of us have. It's even more impressive if together with that you read Luke chapter 12 and verse 6. Nothing could emphasize more God's intimate concern in the smallest details of his creatures. Luke 12 says, 6, Jesus saying, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 copper coins? And not one of them is forgotten before God. So, if you have 1 copper coin, you can buy 2 sparrows. But if you have 2 copper coins, you can buy 5. In other words, an extra sparrow is thrown in, free of charge. And Jesus says, God is interested even in that extra sparrow. Totally different picture from what most of us have of God. He's not remote. He's not uninterested. He's not unaffected. He's concerned about the very smallest of his creatures. And he watches over them all with intense interest.